Alrighty. So please feel free to continue to share where you're coming in from, where you're calling in from. It's so great to have you here. Like I mentioned, this is the Project for Adolescent Literacy. It's our learning community, and we're beginning a new design sprint focused on assessment and data. And this is the development phase. So it's so great to see you. I'll now go on to the next slide. Awesome. So here's a little bit about our agenda today. We've already done our welcome. We're going to be going over some quick norms. Then we're so honored to have Rebecca Sutherland here, who's going to be presenting on the Decoding Threshold study. And this is a really awesome opportunity to learn about some cutting edge new research in the field and implications for adolescent readers. Then we're going to be talking about the design sprint, and then we'll be closing. And so we can go on to the next slide. Okay, on to our norms. Just a few quick norms, like we usually say in these sessions. We're really here to center educators. Everyone is welcome to be here, but we're asking that non-educators take a listening stance. So please, no solicitation of materials and no reporting to any reporters here without permission from educators. We're asking you to be present. We're going to try to find ways to make this as accessible to access as possible. We'll have a Padlet that is always open that you can check out at any time. We're asking for no AI reporting, and we really want to center what works. And so we always inform our work with evidence from the field, including research, teacher experience, and student outcomes. So those are all things that we always center when we have these sessions. A little bit about us. This is our steering committee, and we are coming to you in our phase 2. So we want to thank everybody who checked out our report, and we're now super excited to begin this next phase of work. And as you can see, our steering committee represents educators and folks doing the work from all across the country. And so it's such a joy to be here together because we want to continue to identify what works to help striving adolescent readers. And we're really excited to continue this work and kick things off for the summer. Now, a little bit about the problem that we are working on. I don't have to tell anyone in this room that we are seeing persistent challenges for older readers. And we really want to make sure that the same energy that we're seeing going into elementary intervention and elementary literacy is also going into adolescent literacy. And so, as you can see in these NAEP scores in grades 8 and 12, students are continuing to face challenges, but we know that there are beacons of light and strong practice across the country. So we're working together to identify, curate, and lift up those things. And just a little bit more about us, our vision, our mission. If you've been with us for a few sessions, you've heard these before, but we want to continue to be transparent, evidence-based. We want to celebrate success. We want to focus on storytelling, real talk, and real action, and make sure that things are as open source as possible for folks who join our sessions. Alrighty, now with that, we are moving quick. We are right on time. I'm going to now introduce Rebecca Sutherland, who is here to talk to us about the Decoding Threshold study. And so we're so excited to have you, Rebecca. As I mentioned, Rebecca is here from AERDF, and this is a study that's been talked about a lot lately, especially in the adolescent space. And so again, Rebecca Sutherland from the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we encourage you all to chat in our chat as the presentation happens, to share your reactions and your reflections as we learn. So thank you so much again, Rebecca, for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Christina. Thanks to everyone and welcome. Thanks for joining this evening on a Monday evening. So I'm Rebecca Sutherland. I'm the Associate Director of Research with Reading Reimagined. And as Christina has mentioned, Reading Reimagined is a funded R&D project from the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. That's a mouthful, so we usually call it AERDF for short. And Reading Reimagined has a research agenda that dovetails very nicely with PAL's mission. We are focused on finding foundational literacy solutions for students in grades 3 through 8. So not a perfect overlap with what people typically think of when it comes to adolescent reading. But as we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation, there is actually a continuity, and not just because today's third graders are going to be eighth graders and then they're going to be 12th graders, but because of how literacy instruction is conceived of and delivered in most schools across the country. Okay, so today, as promised, as billed, we are talking about the decoding threshold phenomenon. What is it? What's the evidence for it? And what are the instructional implications? And we can go to the next slide. And oh, look, you'll see a different representation of something that we've just seen in an earlier slide. And it's eighth grade reading proficiency rates according to NAEP going back into the 90s. And the point here is that in the United States, low rates of proficiency are not a new problem. And I suspect that most people on this call already know that. But just to drive home the point, because I think that we see this a lot in popular media, we're coming off the tail of the pandemic, and that certainly didn't help things. But this is not a new problem that we can ascribe to the pandemic. And in fact, we can't even ascribe it to digital devices and some of the other things that you hear cited as a reason why kids aren't reading as much these days. Not saying that smartphones are helping, but when you see that only 32% of eighth graders in 1998 were reading at or above grade level, that illustrates that we can't blame iPhones entirely for the problems that we're facing collectively, um, as researchers, as educators, as parents, and just as concerned citizens. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So at Reading Reimagined, we have labeled this as a problem that's hiding in plain sight. And it was certainly one of the core issues that our founder, our executive director, was grappling with when she, as a leader in education systems, was wondering why year after year, no matter how hard students and teachers were trying, middle school literacy rates in particular just really seemed to be stuck. And so as Reading Reimagined got launched, um, we came across a 2019 study by the Educational Testing Service, that's ETS, that was looking at a novel data set, which was the foundational literacy skills assessed for older students using a developmentally appropriate measurement that ETS had developed. So the test was called ReadBasix, and it has since been commercialized as a test that you can, get a license for, called CAPTI. So because this was a novel data set, you usually don't have assessment data measuring older students' foundational literacy skills. But when you do actually have that data, what you find is very revealing. They found that kids who could not decode text accurately and efficiently had consistently low comprehension scores, even when they were receiving in direct explicit instruction intended to bolster their comprehension. However, for kids who could decode the text that they were asked to read, comprehension scores rose sharply. And so this might seem like kind of a no-brainer, but this has not been part of the conversation that we typically have about reading proficiency among older students. And at Reading Reimagined, we think that decoding is a key to solving the problem that we have collectively and historically had of low reading proficiency rates in upper elementary, middle, and of course, high school. Um, and here's the important distinction that we think that this research is revealing. And it's that decoding is not just phonics. It is phonics in kindergarten and first and second grade, but as kids move up into more advanced text, decoding has to include the ability to accurately and efficiently decode multisyllabic words and to apply knowledge of things like morphology and syntax that become more complicated and abstract and more removed from everyday speech. So we think that the decoding threshold phenomenon, which is what you see in assessment data, reveals that we all collectively need to re-examine the assumptions that we're all holding about how and for how long we provide explicit decoding instructional support to students. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So here you see two different illustrations of data. We've got a graph on the left that is showing a kind of idealized version of what you see in the decoding threshold analysis. So we've got reading comprehension scores going up when decoding scores go up. But the green line in the middle is representing that threshold so that anything to the left of that green line in terms of reading comprehension is pretty low. It's also pretty flat. There's a bit of variation. But for the most part, students who are below the decoding threshold on this particular assessment that ETS developed have low comprehension. And then past that threshold value, it becomes much more variable. You see how the little dots are all spreading out more. There's a sharp average increase, and that is the threshold phenomenon, the inflection point. But importantly, and I will repeat this later, we don't think that decoding is the only thing that older students need, right? They need vocabulary knowledge, they need background knowledge, they need reading fluency. There are a lot of other skills that they need. But what the decoding threshold research is illustrating very starkly is that if they can't decode the text, they're absolutely not going to be able to comprehend it. Then on the right, we've got a table showing from the ETS study, and we revisited it with them last year. We asked them to go back and look at a wider, bigger data set that was so they were replicating their 2019 analysis and expanding it a bit. And from that analysis, we have this table that indicates how many students or the percentages of students in grades 3 through 8 who are below the decoding threshold. So it's as high as almost 40% in third grade. And then it does go down as kids get older. So, more and more kids are getting beyond the decoding threshold for their grade level text. But still, in seventh grade, the fact that 21% of students are below the decoding threshold, that 16% of eighth graders are below the decoding threshold. And remember that just because students are past the decoding threshold does not mean that they are proficient readers, right? We still have fluency, we still have vocabulary and background knowledge. So these are kids that are being held back from comprehension by insufficient decoding skills. Okay, we can move forward. So why do we have this barrier that we recognize that we want to support students decoding in kindergarten, first, second grade, but why have we stopped just when text gets longer and more challenging? So think about that for a minute. As students are getting into upper elementary school and middle school, they are encountering texts that are increasingly complex and that are more removed from their everyday life experiences and the conversations that they would typically have, with their friends, with their family. So they're encountering texts that have longer and more complicated sentence structures than what you typically have in everyday speech. They have abstract content that has domain-specific vocabulary that is not typically part of anyone's, lunchtime conversations. And more most importantly, maybe, is that they are encountering multisyllabic words that have roots that are coming from languages like Greek and Latin that have different orthographic conventions, different spelling conventions than what is taught in kindergarten through third grade or second grade in typical phonics instruction. So the text has become much, much more difficult, and it continues to get difficult as they go up through upper elementary and middle school. And yet we stop providing instructional support for them just as the text is getting more difficult. Okay, we can go on to the next. So, all right, so we've got this question about why. Let's take just a quick pause to kind of summarize what we know so far. We have this hypothesis that the decoding threshold phenomenon is indicating that we need to be providing supports, instructional supports to students that we currently are not providing. And a few other things to keep in mind as we think about this hypothesis. The first is that we know that explicit instruction for decoding stops after third grade. We know that grade level text, as I just have gone into some detail, gets more difficult, and it features higher proportions of multisyllabic words coming from languages like Greek and Latin. We also know that in addition to the multisyllabic decoding challenges, older readers are also contending with text that features longer sentences with more complex syntax, and that also requires increasingly sophisticated knowledge of word morphology, the relationship between educate, education, educator. Those are, all the same root, and yet these different affixes are changing how the words function and what they actually mean. We know that universal literacy skills screening ends in third grade typically. Most states at this point have legislation that is requiring a school and districts to do universal foundational skills screening for students in kindergarten through third grade. But by and large, with maybe a couple of exceptions, I think Minnesota just adopted new legislation requiring foundational literacy skills screening in the whole K through 12 continuum. I think it's K through 12. Someone can correct me on that. I might be wrong. But for the most part, universal skills screening ends after third grade. And then the last thing to bear in mind is that we've got these chronically low rates of reading proficiency in upper elementary school, in middle school, and in high school. Okay, so with all of those things in mind, we can go ahead. So why? Again, why? Why have we stopped providing decoding support? Well, let's pause and think about how we measure students' decoding skills typically. So this is an excerpt from the third grade Dibbles, 8th edition. Many people might be familiar with this, although if you are a high school ELA teacher, you might not know what this is. So this is the nonsense word decoding excerpt from Dibbles. Dibbles is a very well researched and widely used assessment of decoding, and third grade is this is the most difficult level. So you can certainly administer this to a 6th grader or an 8th grader, and it would tell you whether or not the student is able to handle decoding of letter combinations that are 1 and 2 syllables. Let's see. I think we could probably, is there, I should know this by now. I've gone over this slide several times. I don't think there is one that is more than 2 syllables. But this is how we think of decoding, right? We think of it in terms of 1 and 2 syllable words, and therefore that's how we test it. And so there's nothing here that has anything analogous to a word like photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is my favorite go-to example of a word that is not a 1 or 2 syllable word with spelling conventions that are coming from Middle English or Old English. So this is it. This is state-of-the-art assessment data around student decoding that's appropriate for a third grader. And there's really not much else available to test the decoding skills of older students. So if you do suspect that your fifth grader can't accurately and efficiently decode their grade level text and you gave them a test like Dibbles, it might show that they actually are competent at decoding third grade level text. That's not telling you about their ability to decode fifth grade level text or eighth grade level text. So I think this is part of the problem that we're collectively dealing with. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's another, just a couple of short excerpts of text, but just to give you a really concrete flavor of the differences between a fourth grade level text that has a lexile measure of 900, and lexiles are a measure of text complexity that's taking into account sentence length and syntax complexity, but also, how unusual the words are, how rare they are, and how many multisyllabic words. So fourth grade text has words like physical and climates and Mediterranean. So certainly some words that they were not taught to be able to just decode based on what they learned in first or second grade phonics. But then go over to look at what eighth grade text on the right, where we've got much longer sentence structures. We've got a lot more multisyllabic words that are featuring that specialized technical vocabulary that's specific to a domain that it is unlikely to be a part of an eighth grader's everyday vocabulary. Okay, you can go ahead. So that's it. That's the decoding threshold in a nutshell, and why we think it's a challenge for students, and why we think that it's gone unrecognized for so long. And so we were very pleased that ETS was willing to revisit their 2019 study and confirm that yes, with a larger, more diverse sample of um, test data from students across the country, you still see this consistent relationship between inadequate decoding skills and low comprehension. So we think that this is a really fruitful area to dig into for practitioners, but we still have, from a research perspective, a lot of outstanding questions. And so here's some of the things that we don't yet know about the decoding threshold that we would love to figure out. The first is there a typical developmental trajectory for decoding more complex text? There could be. Or it might change based on the text. Some of the existing research on, I'll come to that in a moment, or I was thinking of the research coming from the baseball studies. There's also a question around the relationship between multisyllabic decoding ability that students have in fourth, fifth, sixth grade, and the instructional methods that were used to teach decoding in K through 2. Hopefully students are now consistently receiving explicit systematic phonics instruction in K through 2. Of course, we know that that has not always been the case, and I think that sadly it's still not truly the case everywhere. But I think that there's been a pretty big sea change for that K through 2 explicit decoding instruction principle, but we don't yet see that relationship playing out in upper grades. So we're wondering about the relationship between what they experienced in K through 2 and how well students are able to decode multisyllabic text. And then do we see some students move back and forth across the decoding threshold, depending on the type of text that they're asked to read? So this is what I was prematurely getting to with the baseball studies. Students that have a lot of pre-existing knowledge in a domain, this is the focus of the baseball studies, can often read independently text that, if it was of the same complexity in a different topic that they did not have knowledge of, that their pre-existing conceptual frameworks, their knowledge of specialized vocabulary, helps them decode text that's of a complexity that they otherwise would not be able to decode. And then a final question that we have is, how does pre-existing literacy knowledge in another language affect multilingual learner students' English decoding abilities? So I think that that question will be very fruitful to dig into as we go forward, but will almost certainly depend on what the native language is. If there are, so Spanish speakers, there are many root words that are coming from Greek and Latin also in Spanish. And so there are cognates with English words. And even though Spanish orthography is different than English orthography, there are some similarities. Whereas Arabic or Chinese, you're not so likely to find that kind of helpful relationship between the student's native language and their developing English literacy skills. Um, is that, no, we can still go for it. I was like, is that my last slide? No. Here's my reminder of the point that I made before, and that is that, yes, at Reading Reimagined, we really care, we're focused on figuring out how we can better support students developing foundational literacy skills like decoding. With that said, we don't think that decoding skills or foundational literacy skills collectively are a silver bullet that will take care of all of students' reading proficiency learning needs. We absolutely recognize that in order for older readers to be able to independently comprehend grade level text, they also need instructional support in crucial areas like reading fluency, background knowledge, and vocabulary. We emphasize the decoding threshold, however, because it's been omitted from the conversation about reading instruction for students after third grade. And we think that the decoding threshold research illustrates very aptly how that oversight has been at least one of the roots of our chronic low reading proficiency rates. Okay, I think there's one more slide. Yes. So some takeaways then. If I could make one recommendation for teachers and for education leaders, it would be to measure the foundational literacy skills of older students using a developmentally appropriate assessment that can measure comprehension, which is very important and arguably the purpose of reading and reading instruction, but that is also measuring students' foundational literacy skills that include more advanced foundational skills like multisyllabic decoding, like morphology, like syntax. So once you have that assessment data, that's accurate and current for your students, then you can intervene, and you can do it in a differentiated and appropriate to the student way, which will focus on supporting the skills that a given student still needs assistance in. Um, so that all students are on a path to being able to independently engage with grade level text so that they can comprehend. Because without that assessment data, if you're just, you're looking at students, well, they were fine in third grade, so I think they've got decoding down. We're in fifth grade now. You don't actually know that they're fine with decoding. You end up either only intervening around comprehension or things like vocabulary and background knowledge, or you end up inappropriately putting in front of students interventions that are around the most basic decoding skills that they should have had addressed in kindergarten through second or third grade. Now, of course, some older readers do need that support, but a lot of kids actually do have solid decoding skills for words that are appropriate for first and second and even third grade. But what they don't have are automated reading skills for multisyllabic words and longer passages of text. And that is the decoding threshold in a nutshell. I haven't been looking at the chat, so if there were questions, I need to look at them.
Yes, Rebecca, that was absolutely amazing. And, we were encouraging folks to share some noticings and ideas and questions. We will have a formal Q&A now where we'll give folks a chance to raise their hands and share or repost in chat. So no worries there. And we just want to thank you so, so much for your presentation. Extremely informative. And now we have until about 15 after for some Q&A. This is such an
Okay,
awesome
great.
opportunity. Awesome, if that's all right. And this is a really great opportunity to really dig into the study, to dig into the research. And so we're asking folks, you can either raise your hand using the Zoom setting, or you can put a question in the chat. But please feel free to raise your hand, put a question in the chat from now on, and we'll feature that in this Q&A segment. But I just wanted to queue up a first question around further implications for adolescent striving readers. And like
Mhm.
Rebecca, we're trying to kick things off and focus on assessment and data because we saw that so many teachers across the country have assessments that they're using because they were given to them, or their school uses them, or they have things that they're creating on their own. But far too often, teachers feel, to your point, that they might have something and it isn't quite developmentally appropriate, or they're not sure if it's quite what they need to pinpoint the struggles a student might be experiencing. So on my end, I know you've talked about implications thus far for adolescent striving readers, but could you talk a bit more about what it might mean to know that an assessment is developmentally appropriate for an
Mhm.
older reader versus not? Someone mentioned in the chat, Dibbles has expanded on to eighth grade. I know Acadians, ALO, like there's a lot coming down
Mhm.
the system, but could you talk a little bit more about what differentiates developmentally appropriate for not? That's something we hope to
Yeah.
dig into.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I should first name that commercially available assessments are constantly evolving, and as phenomenon like the decoding threshold get it more into the mainstream conversations that we have around literacy, I expect that we will see more commercially available literacy assessments take on explicitly things like multisyllabic decoding or morphology knowledge. So let's just stick with those two as examples of what we mean by more advanced decoding skills. So I showed you that quick little excerpt of Dibble's third grade decoding. Dibbles is normed up through eighth grade, but as far as I'm aware, they're decoding the most that what we saw, that's as difficult as the decoding challenges get on Dibbles. They're also looking at reading fluency and also comprehension, so that there are other dimensions of reading ability that a test like Dibbles is testing. But when it comes to decoding, it's really stopping at about that third grade level. Um, I mentioned that ETS's research was done with a test that they had themselves developed called ReadBasix that has since been commercialized as it's called CAPTI. Here, I'll just put it in the chat. So CAPTI is a computer adapted test that does explicitly test things like morphology and syntax, in addition to mm, other facets, other components of reading and reading comprehension. So that is, it's the fact that they're explicitly testing morphology and syntax that makes a test like CAPTI developmentally appropriate for older readers, because we don't have the same expectations. Of course, morphology knowledge comes into play in the speech and reading abilities of the youngest students. Like they know that when you add the letter S at the end of a word, that it becomes plural or es, depending on the spelling. So simple morphology is at play even in early elementary school. But again, like to take educate, educator, education, and how different suffixes and prefixes can change the meanings of words and also their pronunciation sometimes. Um, And that kind of knowledge is really much more in the domain of upper elementary and middle school. And so making sure that you're actually testing students' knowledge of these things with the expectation that you might need to explicitly intervene and give some instruction to help students be able to decode based on morphological changes, to be able to engage with sentences that have, much longer, syntactic structure with embedded phrases. Those are things that you would expect to see only for an assessment that was designed for older readers, like CAPTI. But there's another assessment that Reading Reimagined has worked with very closely, called the Rapid Online Assessment of Reading, and or ROAR for short. And that is a tool coming out of Stanford, and it's free. So CAPTI, you have to pay for a license to use. ROAR is free. ROAR is still a work in progress. It's being built. They have right now the ability to measure students' letter knowledge, their phoneme knowledge, their word reading efficiency, and their sentence reading efficiency. And so they are soon to have phonics that will ultimately include multisyllabic words as well as words of just 1 and 2 syllables, morphology, syntax, and then a measure of comprehension. And so within the next year, the ROAR assessment, the suite of assessments that are the ROAR tests, will be available for, I mean, they're already available with the 4 that have already been built, but there will be a full span of assessment modules from ROAR that will be available for anyone in the country to use.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much. It's really cool to hear, more about ReadBasix, which, like you said, has turned into CAPTI, like
Mhm.
on the market now. Roar, which we've heard Roar come out quite a few times over the course
Yeah.
of the research. So that's really exciting and really, really helpful to know. We've got another question here from Molly. Molly, I'm going to read your question. Molly asks, I noticed that fewer and fewer students are below the threshold as we go up in grades. Is that because students are dropping out and not being measured anymore? Or because they are actually improving their decoding through whatever instruction is happening at school? Do we know? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I think, I mean, certainly by the time students are in 8th grade, if they've been held back for a year or two, it's quite possible that they could be dropping out. I do think that, that's something to bear in mind when we look at high school reading proficiency rates, right? The decline from 3rd to 8th grade of the proportion of students that are below the decoding threshold between 3rd grade, which is almost 40%, and then 8th grade, it's 16% from the study last year. A couple of things. I think that as students, after 8th grade, I'm not sure, by 6th, 7th, 8th grade, text complexity is maybe leveling off a little bit in terms of like the text that students are being asked to read. And so, but the difference, as we saw, between 8th grade text and 4th grade text is pretty substantial. And so kids are moving up through the grades, and the difficulty of text is increasing. But maybe by 7th and 8th grade, it's starting to level off a bit. And so you have kids that are, just starting to catch up, um, just through most of them probably are not receiving explicit instructional support, but just through their own development and casual exposure to decoding, that they're getting there. So there is some self-teaching and some bootstrapping, but not, it's not enough for many students. And I guess I should also point out that the 2024 study that ETS undertook with Reading Reimagined was using CAPTI data, but we think that probably that data isn't entirely representative of all students in the country, because who are the districts that are choosing proactively to test, to pay, in fact, to pay to test the foundational skills of their older readers when they're not mandated to do it by, by any state laws. So those districts might be ahead of the curve in resources or in just proactively thinking about what their students might need to support their literacy. So we think that it's possible, but we don't have any evidence right now. That table is the only evidence that we have right now that's explicitly measuring the decoding threshold. So we do treat that as definitive, but we then kind of maybe put a little caveat around that and think in supposing that perhaps that's data that's coming from districts that are a little more proactive in testing student knowledge.
Um, Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And
Yeah.
so much wonderful discussion happening in the chat. And we always joke like an hour flies by way too fast whenever we're together, but we're so thankful. That's really helpful and helpful to get a bit more insight into, yes, what's been done around the research, what's coming up next, and these nuances. And so we have another question here. Matlalapula, and please forgive me if I've mispronounced your name. Want to thank you for your questions. This will be the last question we'll do just for this segment, just because we're going to move on to the next section. But please, everybody, more conversations like this will be happening in the design sprint. So hold those questions if we didn't get to you. This question says, can I be able to use these with the students whose English is their second language? I think you might have mentioned, we're just to address,
Yeah.
in South Africa, most learners are in the previously formal Model C schools, but English is not their native home language. So just another question around English language learners and how to address supports for striving adolescent readers or EL students as well, L students.
Yeah. It's a great question. I feel like there are a couple of different facets to that question. When it comes to assessment, um, if you are trying to measure students' knowledge of English orthography, their spelling conventions and English decoding, then using, even if English is not their first language, using an English test of those skills and that knowledge is appropriate. Um, I think that Claude Goldenberg, who's an expert on biliteracy and literacy acquisition among second language learners or third language learners, what he often says is that multilingual learners need everything that native speakers need, and they just need more of it. So more opportunities with scaffolding and instructional support. I feel like there was another facet to that question, and maybe I got intrigued by the South African context. Did I answer it entirely, Christina? Or
Yeah, yes, I believe so.
okay,
Saying that there's certainly applicable in terms of assessment and what's out there. And do you feel that, I suppose, that what's accessible for students whose English is their L1, students who are
Mhm.
English learners, you're saying that adolescent students can still be assessed with a lot of these same developmentally appropriate tools?
Right. I mean, if their conversational English is very basic, if they are newcomers to English, then obviously expecting them to be decoding multisyllabic words in English or to understand how English morphology works would not be a good use of their instructional time. But if these are students that are, being asked to read English text after having been instructed in English for several years, then using a test that is assessing their knowledge in these domains certainly is appropriate. It will just probably reveal more needs in foundational skills than maybe L1 students might have.
Um, Awesome. That's really helpful and something we want to continue to uplift as we think of this the experiences of students who are experiencing multiple aspects of the educational system and really need support so that we can address and support them in their language development and their reading skills. So I want to thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you again. Folks, feel free to continue to discuss in the chat. Really great discussion, but just to be mindful of time, we'll now move on to the next slide, where I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming up next for PAL, which is super related to this topic, closely connected. And so we're so thankful because we heard everyone loud and clear. The number one thing that educators said that they want is community. And so we are deciding to create these design sprints. You can also think of them as working groups. And we're creating them based on the different topics that came in our report, which again, if you haven't gotten a chance to read our report, it's on the C. Brown website. And so this sprint is going to be focused on assessment and data. It's going to be a 6-week series, a 6-week cycle. We're going to be focusing on assessment, and you're going to have homework. And so we're going to be asking you all, just like we give homework to students, you're going to be asked to bring things to the table, to curate things, to help us really create a bit of a startup environment as we focus on this topic. And so we're really going to be centering in on assessment in this cycle of 6 weeks. And we're going to be working together to curate resources and a list of different assessments that we're aware of. And we're working our way towards a database of resources, which a lot of educators across the country said that they wanted. And so it's going to be a bit of a, like I said, a startup feel, but we want to remind everyone that you shouldn't feel intimidated if you feel like you don't know all the different fancy assessments out there. It can be an assessment that you like personally and you enjoy using in your classroom. It can also be a very norm reference and research assessment too. Anything you like, anywhere you're coming from, you're invited to join us in this work. And so we're going to be dropping, it's already in the chat, but if you take a look at this document that we put in the chat, Kate put it in the chat, you'll get more details about what the sprint will look like. And we're excited to work with as many educators as possible in these 6 weeks to really dig into this work together. We go to the next slide. This is just a little bit more about what we're imagining for this cycle of inquiry. In the fall, we're going to be doing some work applying what we do in the summer. But first in the summer, we're really reflecting on what we just learned. Rebecca and AERDF has been so supportive, and they're serving as a partner to us in this work. So a thought partner, we can continue to dig into the study that we just learned about today to kind of ground our work. But we'll be designing and again, creating this list of resources as a team over 6 weeks. And then in the fall, we'll have an opportunity to actually take some of these assessments, apply them and put them into practice, and think about what it's like to implement these things in the classroom as adolescent educators. And so we're really hoping that folks can join us in this work because we're excited to curate this information so that teachers across the country can have it in time for school to start again in the fall. Just a little bit more about the design cycle. All the information will be in the slide deck that you have. But as I mentioned, it'll be 6 weeks. We'll be kicking off next week. And you'll get homework of things to do from week to week, connected to different aspects of assessment that we think will be really interesting for us to dig into. That's a great question, Jordan. I see your question in the chat about obtaining consent for implementing. That's something we'll definitely want to talk about in the fall. We're certainly, building this together for the first time. And we want to make sure that we are covering all of our bases in terms of being mindful of any personal information of students. So we'll talk more in the fall about what it will look like when implementing. It might also be that there's an assessment that you're going to implement anyway at your school that you can just share with us as you implement, because you're already doing that at your school. And so we'll be looking at word recognition and decoding, oral reading fluency, vocabulary knowledge and morphological skills, and reading comprehension, which personally, I'm really excited to talk about that one in this cycle and what it looks like to assess reading comprehension for striving older readers. So all this will be great. And we're hoping to look at not only in the intervention space what assessment looks like, but what people can do, what teachers can do to assess across secondary grade levels and all content areas. So any ideas you have, you can bring them to the table. Any
Thanks,
questions
Christina.
about this? Yes. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, so that's sort of like the pitch on our design sprints. And so we have a little bit about next steps, but before we talk about that, it's probably the moment to pause and see what questions you have about the design sprints, signing up, etc. Oh, I'm glad you're excited, Lorraine. We're super excited too. But feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute and ask any clarifying questions you might have. Great question, Sasha. That's a great question. I think that we will probably wrestle with on our first meeting is like, I use fill in the blank and I think it's great. And I really learn a lot about my students and it really helps me nail down the fact that they are struggling with fill in the blank, but you have to pay for it, right? So that's part of the conversation that we would have. I don't feel like it's immediately a barrier.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's my situation, and mine is more like educators don't like this, and could we use something else? Our district mandates X assessment, and X assessment does not support the needs of our teachers. You see where I'm going?
Yes, lots of nodding heads. We all know what you're talking about. So I think I'm going to put two links in the chat. One is another link again to the sort of overview of the design sprints. The first page is in general, like what are these sprints? When are they happening? What are they about? Like why? Like what's going on? And then the second one is about registration. So how do you register for the first set of design sprints where we're going to sort of hash out some of the stuff around assessment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you're interested, please sign up. We would love for you to participate in all of the sessions in a sprint, but we know this is summer and like this is real life and vacations and children and other work happens. So please come as you are and come as you can. The learning is best when we are all there. And Alana, I love your question. Yes is my general answer to your question. So so your next steps, if you're interested in joining this design sprint, is to review the document so you sort of understand what it is we're asking you for and sign up on the link. There's a link in the overview document that takes you to the Zoom registration page, and that page is also, the Zoom registration page is also in the chat. We will meet again, same bat time, same bat channel next week. So Monday at 2:30 Pacific, 6:30 Eastern. And we ask that you bring, and the focus of that meeting is going to be on word recognition and decoding skills. So what do you use to determine your students' word recognition and decoding skills? And as Christina said, bring your fancy norm reference assessments and bring the things you use informally in your classroom and every point in between. That's really, we're trying to really create a list of what works from a variety of different perspectives. And if you are like, assessment's not my bag, you have nothing to contribute and you don't care about it, then we see you and please come back next time. So we'll have our next, as you can see in the overview, the next set of sprints is really around instructional strategies, instructional moves, and we welcome you to come and participate in that. So please make sure you sort of are on our mailing list so you can stay tuned for what's next. Any other questions for design sprints? Alana, I think to answer your question, I want to say yes, if you have things you want to contribute, but the time doesn't work, you're like, hey, here's my 3 like favorite assessments, send them to that pal at Seek Common Ground email. That's just Christina. And she'll get them, and she'll make sure that your resources are shared. So we're happy to take links, etc., for folks. All right, so if there's not a ton of other questions, I'm going to move us on just out of respect for time. And as always, we are looking for case studies and testimonials. So if you have some, this is just a little plug reminder to record a video about what works for you. We have a couple of requirements that are listed there on the screen, and you can email them again to PAL at the Seek Common Ground email address. We won't post them unless you explicitly tell us we can, but we'd like to share them. And there's been some coming in, so we really appreciate those of you who have sent some. The power of video is really, as we all know, can be really, really powerful in our classroom. So we're always looking for those. And let's make sure we keep in touch. If you're not yet on our mailing list, go ahead and email Christina and say you want to be on our mailing list. If you want to sign up all your friends, you can tell them to email too. I know that this time of year is either like pure chaos because you're still in school, trying to get everybody out the door, graduated, happy, smiling faces, or it's like pure exhaustion because you just finished the marathon that is the end of the school year. So really appreciate you all coming so much. Another shout out to Rebecca for coming and sharing the research on the decoding threshold with us. It's so compelling and so interesting. And we hope to see y'all next week.